Hello and welcome to this brand new edition of Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha, Khanna, and our focus continues to be on the Israel-Hamas conflict. It's day 61 of the Israel-Hamas war and heavy fighting is taking place across Gaza with house-to-house fighting reported as Israeli forces intensify their ground operation. Tanks are closing in on three areas: Khan Yunis in the south and Jabalia and Shujaya in the north, where hundreds of thousands of civilians still remain. The United Nations says 600,000 people are under evacuation orders in southern Gaza, but there is nowhere to go because shelters are so full. A Palestinian journalist in Khan Yunis has been quoted as saying airstrikes are taking place every few minutes and everything is shaking. On Tuesday, Israel said its troops had reached the heart of Khan Yunis, the largest southern city, on the most intense day of fighting in its ground operation. Israel believes Hamas leaders could be hiding in the city, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists the war can only be won with crushing force. The Hamas attack in Israel, which sparked this war, killed 1,200 people with around 240 others taken hostage. Hamas officials in Gaza say at least 16,200 people have been killed in Israel's retaliatory campaign, including about 7,000 children. Meanwhile, spine-chilling details of the unspeakable sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas terrorists against Israeli women on the 7th of October are now emerging. Israel says there is indisputable evidence of gruesome rapes, barbaric sexual assaults, and even mutilation of scores of women who were brutalized on the bloodiest day in Israel's history. The details that have emerged are so macabre, graphic and disturbing that it's difficult for us to share all those details with our viewers. Many international media houses have reported that eyewitnesses and those involved in collecting and identifying the bodies of the victims who were killed have seen innumerable signs of sexual assault, including broken pelvises, bruises, cuts and tears. The victims ranged from children and teenagers to pensioners. Videos of naked and bloodied women filmed by Hamas on the day of the attack and photographs of bodies taken at the sites afterwards clearly suggest that women were sexually targeted by their attackers, and few victims survived to tell their own stories. In one case, the Hamas terrorists gang-raped a woman and mercilessly mutilated her before the last of her attackers shot her in the head even as he continued to rape her. Many of these women who were brutally assaulted had their body parts chopped off. In other instances, women were raped and then decapitated. The nature of the assault in most of these cases can only be described as beastly and inhuman. Some women were raped before they were dead, some were raped while injured, and some were already dead when the terrorists raped their lifeless bodies. Those who did manage to survive these attacks are currently receiving psychiatric treatment. They're unable to even talk. But a majority were brutally murdered. It is evident that Hamas weaponized the bodies of these women. Hundreds of bodies were collected from the attack sites, scores of them butchered. A doctor who treated some of the 110 released hostages has said that at least 10 women and men amongst those freed were sexually assaulted or abused. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has lashed out at the United Nations and other agencies over their silence on this matter. He said, and I quote, "I say to the women's rights organizations, to the human rights organizations, you've heard of the rape of Israeli women, horrible atrocities, sexual mutilation. Where the hell are you?" US President Joe Biden has said, over the past few weeks, survivors and witnesses of the attacks have shared the horrific accounts of unimaginable cruelty. Reports of women raped, repeatedly raped, and their bodies being mutilated while still alive, of women corpses being desecrated, Hamas terrorists inflicting as much pain and suffering on women and girls as possible and then murdering them. It is appalling. The world can't just look away at what's going on. It's on all of us to forcibly condemn the sexual violence of Hamas terrorists without equivocation, he said.
Today, along with the cabinet ministers, I met with the families of the hostages, those who have returned home and those who we are trying to bring back home. I heard stories that broke my heart. I heard about the thirst and hunger, about physical and mental abuse, about the little witnesses that are still whispering from fear, about the darkness the loved ones still live under. I heard, and you also heard, about sexual assault and cases of brutal rape, unlike anything. But I must say that just until a few days, I didn't hear human rights organizations and women's rights organizations. I didn't hear women's organizations in the UN. I didn't hear their outrage. Our fighters are expanding the ground operation against Hamas in every place in the Strip, including the south of the Strip. Tonight, we operated there with massive force. The earth shook in Khan Yunis. The earth shook in Jabalia. We besieged both of them. There is no place beyond our reach. We took control of the General Security Command of the Hamas. Our brave soldiers are fighting powerfully against the killers. They are conducting close-quarter battles. They are eliminating terrorists around the clock, and we are the upper hand in every battle.
As the IDF expands its operations to dismantle Hamas in Gaza, we have not lost sight, not for one moment, of our critical mission to rescue our hostages, to do everything in our power to bring our hostages home. Our intelligence has been monitoring the situation of our hostages, and I can say with absolute certainty, every minute in Hamas captivity endangers their lives. This is an urgent call for action. The international community must take action. The Red Cross must have access to the hostages that are in the hands of Hamas. 138 hostages, children, women, men, the elderly, have been in Hamas captivity for over 60 days, in brutal and inhumane conditions. Some of the hostages in Hamas captivity have chronic illness and life-threatening conditions. Some of the men and women in Hamas captivity were injured during the massacre of October 7th. Some have been harmed since. Every day, every hour, every minute is critical. The lives of our hostages are at risk.
The catastrophic situation we see unfolding in the Gaza Strip was entirely foreseeable and preventable. My humanitarian colleagues have described the situation as apocalyptic. In these circumstances, there is a heightened risk of atrocity crimes. Measures need to be taken urgently, both by the parties concerned and by all states, particularly those with influence, to prevent any such crimes. The international community needs to insist with one voice on a ceasefire immediately on human rights and humanitarian grounds. Palestinians in Gaza are living in utter, deepening horror. Military operations, including bombardments by Israeli forces, continue in North, Middle, and South Gaza, affecting people who have already been displaced multiple times, forced to flee in search of safety. But no place is safe. As we speak, some 1.9 million out of the 2.2 million Palestinians have been displaced and are being pushed into ever-diminishing and extremely overcrowded places in southern Gaza in unsanitary and unhealthy conditions. And humanitarian aid is again virtually cut off as fears of widespread disease and hunger spread.
All right, let's introduce our guests. Joining me on the show tonight is Anat Bernstein-Reich. She's the president of the Israel-Asia Chamber of Commerce and CEO of Israel-India Investment Banking at BDO in Israel. Thank you so much, Anat, for joining us once again. Irina Sukerman, national security and geopolitical analyst, joins us live from New York. And Ambassador Manju Seth, former Indian diplomat, is also with us. She joins us from New Delhi. A warm welcome to all my guests. Anat, if I could start with you. Yes, we've for days and weeks now talked about the ongoing war in Gaza and how it's now spreading from the north to the south. We come to that in a moment. But first, I want to focus on the horrors of what the Israeli women had to go through or were subjected to on the 7th of October during the bloodiest day in Israel's history. We've known for 2 months now that 1,200 Israelis were butchered and 240 people, again most of them Israelis, were taken hostage. However, the details of the sexual violence and assaults that are emerging now, I think, are absolutely spine-chilling and horrific. I'm not suggesting that we were not aware of this earlier, but as more and more eyewitness accounts come forward, it is becoming clear that the Hamas terrorists brutalized those women in the most unspeakable fashion, turning their bodies into battlegrounds, as it were. Do you believe that the world has, in a sense, ignored these horrific and unspeakable sexual crimes that took place that day?
Good evening, Neha, and thanks for having me again in your show. A very important topic that you're bringing today. And yes, as you rightly said, the world ignored the atrocities. It's beyond atrocities. It's I don't even have words to say what those terrorists or monsters did to the women on October 7th. The testimonials were there from the first beginning, but it took time really to collect all the information, and it's a massive attack and so many stories, and we are creating the pieces of the puzzle, and now we are getting into some understanding what really happened there. And the world was quiet, and although women organizations in Israel approached women organizations globally, the UN Women, other women rights clinics and organizations in the US, there was silence. Only a week back, UN Women put a condemnation note, but it was too little and too late. They clubbed it along with other wrongs that are with women in Gaza. You cannot compare the two. What happened to women by Hamas in October 7 is uncomparable. And when terrorists that were held in Israel from this attack were investigated, it was premeditated. It wasn't just the decision of the terrorists that attacked in October 7 to rape. That was the plan of Hamas. And it's not just one that did it. You see many cases, tens and hundreds of cases that it happened, which makes us really think, who are those monsters? What is their sick mind that's the way they are fighting? I mean, we've seen terror attacks in the past, but this attack against women, and you rightly said that the women body was the battlefield. This is appalling. This is something that maybe the world will start to understand, and we are calling women organizations that usually say to women, we trust you, we believe you. No one believed until we had to go to the UN with those testimonials and really bring it. And it's very difficult information to watch and hear, but we need to do it because otherwise no one believes us. And it needs to be heard, and those people, women are no more with us. We need to be their mouth. We need to talk on their behalf. They cannot do it anymore.
You're right, Anat. most of the women who were brutalized by those monsters in unspeakable ways actually did not survive to tell the tale. Very, very few have managed to survive, and one cannot begin to imagine how they would have been scarred for life. We are told that even those who witnessed these acts are undergoing psychiatric treatment right now and are unable to talk to anybody. They're unable to talk to investigators, to their families, to the doctors about what happened. Chances are they may never be able to talk about it. In fact, as I said at the start of my show, the details I have come across as a journalist are so macabre, so gruesome and so disturbing, I couldn't bring myself to share all those details with my viewers. I'll be honest, it was so, such a tough decision for me. I couldn't figure out for the longest time what I could put out for my viewers and what information I needed to withhold despite understanding how crucial it is. So the question I want to ask you, Anat, is this. Unfortunately, we increasingly are witnessing weaponization of women's bodies during wars and conflicts. There is no doubt that the kind of butchery that was perpetrated by these men, beasts actually, is in many ways unprecedented. I think they've outdone ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But fact of the matter is that sexual violence seems to have become a weapon of war. How do we deal with it? Because unfortunately, as wars start and wars are fought over months and years, these are crimes that are often forgotten. The women are usually forgotten.
I don't have any immediate solution to avoid this, because as long as we have those monsters in the world, unless we are able to get our hands on them, I don't know what to do. But I do know that at least not just women organizations, governments, bodies, and of course the women organizations need to categorically condemn it and not club it with other things. This act was unacceptable, and the Hamas did it, and it needs to be said. That's the first step. Unfortunately, it will continue with the behavior of Hamas. They are following ISIS, and I'm sure that other terror groups will copy it. That's another problem. That's why it is so important for Israel to eradicate Hamas, because it is contagious. They start here, it will come to other places in the world. They are using the techniques that they used in this October 7, and they'll duplicate it, because it's not just about Israel, it's much more wider. And that's why we need to unite in order to fight those behaviors which are beyond just unhuman. They are barbarian, they are monstrous, they are beasts, as you said, something that we need to eradicate from the world. And unfortunately, we women are suffering a great deal from those barbarians, and we need to stand strong together. I can ask a woman to condemn it easier, because she can understand the suffering of the women of October 7th.
You're right. The people who did this are barbarians, and there are really no words to describe the horror. Irina, let me come to you now. I don't know what it is about these sick minds that makes them believe that women's bodies can be weaponized, that when there is a conflict or a war taking place, they can sexually abuse, assault, rape, sexually torture, mutilate women, because that's what happened to scores of Israeli women on the 7th of October. Many of them had their body parts chopped off. dead bodies were desecrated. They didn't even spare the dead. Do you believe the world has by and large ignored this absolutely horrific aspect of those terror attacks that took place in Israel on the 7th of October? And how do you think we need to draw attention to this? Because like I said, more often than not, it is the women who tend to be easily forgotten. They are sometimes the worst victims, the worst sufferers, and also the most easily forgotten.
It is unfortunate, but absolutely accurate to say that this has been deliberately swept under the rug because it is horrific, it is inconvenient, and it also does not run with the ideologies of accommodation in attempt to come to some sort of a compromise or political consensus on the Gaza issue. There's been a lot of talk about the two-state solution, but not a lot of talk about the fact that one cannot have a state where rapists, whose very ideology is entirely dehumanizing, are in charge and making decisions. Because these rapes were systematic. They were not individual decisions that sometimes unfortunately happen in the course of war. They were part of a systematic campaign, and they were part of the modus operandi of Hamas and other Islamist organizations, deliberately so to inflict psychological warfare on the Israeli populations and to send a signal of power. And more importantly, I'd also suggest that as terrible as it is that the women's rights organizations are remaining silent, even worse is the fact that that sexual assaults on men that took place during these campaigns is being underplayed. First, because men also deserve compassion and justice, and for them the stigma is no less than for women who have suffered this. And second, because it underscores the political aspect of the rapes. In this case, this was absolutely a projection of power and ideology of Hamas. Worth noting also, as Anat previously mentioned, about the copying of these methods. Actually, these methods have been implemented before by other Iran-backed and Islamist groups and terrorist organizations in the region. The Houthis systematically use rape of women in prisons, not only to abuse them, not only to show their dominance in the situation, not only to terrorize them, but because they know that in conservative communities, when these women go back, they'll be rejected. And it traumatizes the entire community and breaks up the family. So Hamas is not merely punishing the women or showing their complete lack of humanity for women. They're also aiming to break up the Israeli families, the entire society, because they know when they attack women, they attack symbolically motherhood, they attack this feminine aspect of society that in their mind the entire society is trying to protect. This is very much a political message aimed at entire breakdown of the society, breakdown of Israel, and the fact that the world is silent only enables and empowers them to continue with such methods.
All right, how do we put an end to this madness? I wish we had the answer. Ambassador Manju Seth, let me come to you. You and I have discussed geopolitics on multiple shows. Tonight, we're discussing a different issue. The butchery and barbarism that were on display on the 7th of October, most people seem to believe was systematic and quite premeditated. The idea was for those monsters to not just sexually violate and traumatize and torture these women, but to terrorize an entire people, to leave them scarred. What does one say about how increasingly women's bodies are being used as battlefields, how horrific sexual violence is now a weapon of war? And it seems like the world is not ready to even talk about it, leave alone address it.
Absolutely, Neha, you are absolutely right, and as are the other panelists. on this issue, because I think what happens, I believe, is that women across the world in different societies are considered somehow as lesser beings, and it is only the men who believe that they have the power, and as mentioned by you also, this is an attempt to sort of dehumanize them and to break up families and to send a message that the societies will be broken, and that will be a psychological setback for the entire community, for the entire society. So this is another kind of psychological warfare, and they are weaponizing women and women's bodies, and also, as mentioned by I think Irina, that men also were sexually abused. So it is again an attempt to break people's minds, to make them, to subdue them, and to send a message that we can do what we want because we are men and we can do what we like. But Hamas particularly, it's a terrorist organization, and its entire mentality and its entire approach has been visible right from the beginning, from many years, but now particularly in this particular from the 7th of October, the way they have been behaving and the way they have been conducting the whole, the hostages, and the way they've brutalized the hostages. I think they are, of course, completely inhuman, and they are, I think, they don't represent the Palestinian people. And so that, this whole war is, it's like they say collateral damage. A lot of people say collateral damage and of war, and this is what is happening. The Palestinians are suffering. Yes, but the fact is that the large majority of Palestinians have elected them. That's what they say. They've elected them, or they have put them in power there. So that needs to change. The Palestinian people also need to understand that Hamas is not their representative. And the UN, of course, I think in many ways has not lived up, should I say, to its mandate, to its role of ensuring that these kind of incidents don't take place. And if something takes place of this kind, it ought to be, action ought to be taken, it ought to be condemned, and ought to be stopped. So I think in that way, in that sense, I think the UN has not lived up to to what it could have done. Though I'm not very sure what it could have done, in how effective it could have been, whatever it did. But at the same time, it definitely should have been quick to condemn this and quick to find and to support the action against the Hamas. But that apart, I would also like to say that Israel, the Israeli people, the Israeli government, of course, would like to see an end to Hamas, but there is too much civilian damage. So maybe the world needs to sit together, and the Israeli government needs to sit together and find an effective way out of this situation where at least the civilians are not harmed like this or not killed in this manner. But that is equally sad and equally, not to be condoned and not very acceptable. So I think it is a very difficult situation for Israel also. While I fully, I know that Israel tried. They had a ceasefire to try and see if something could be done. But I think the Hamas is not. It's a terrorist organization. It says it's a government, but it's a terrorist organization, and they have no rules. They don't follow any rules or follow any.
In fact, reports suggest that the primary reason why talks about further release of hostages and an extension of the truce broke down is because Hamas was not willing to release the remaining women hostages, which is something that Israel was insisting on, and rightly so. So let me go back to Anat on this. Anat, some of the doctors who've treated the released hostages have given interviews saying that quite a few of these hostages, men and women, both, were sexually assaulted or abused while in captivity. Would it be correct to say that even as there are fears, obviously, for their lives, equally there is a concern as time passes by about what kind of horrors the women hostages in particular may be subjected to by these terrorists, given what we know has already happened on the 7th of October.
Now you're totally right. Hamas broke the ceasefire on the day that they were supposed to release 10 women. And they came up with so many, I would say, stupid excuses. And the US spokesdepartment, Matthew Miller, said something very interesting. Maybe they didn't want to release those women because then those women will tell what they went through in the captivity. So that's why it's even more urgent to release those women ASAP. When you spoke about the doctors, one of the doctors, Professor Pesach, the head of the Sheba Medical Center, was asked about the experience of the hostage that were released and came to his hospital. And he said, I need to respect their privacy. But let me tell you that one day when those hostages will be able to speak up, or when I will be able to tell their story, no one will sleep at night. And this sentence made us really worry to know what those hostages went through and what the balance 138 hostages still kept with Hamas are going through. Many came slim, many were starved, beyond the torturing and maybe also the sexual abuse that I truly hope that they are not going through, but there are good chances that some of the women do go through sexual abuse during their captivity. Each day that passes, the chances of those hostages being released alive, the chances are declining. And we call, of course, for the release of those hostages. It's already 61 days, and many, one of them were one of the released ladies was hospitalized today in severe condition because for 50 days she didn't take her medication. So her condition deteriorated dramatically. And I'm sure that many hostages also need their medication. Men above the age of 70 and 80 are still in captivity. I mean, those monsters are monster in any aspects, also in the way they treat the captive, the hostages. And we spoke about the Red Cross. The Red Cross became a shuttle service during the hostage release. That's all. They are not able to meet the hostages. They were not able to deliver to them medication. They were not able to check on their condition. Why do they exist? We don't understand. We are asking those questions. And I think that the Red Cross will have to explain to the world, where have you been? Where have they been in this war? This is a question for the Red Cross that I'd like to bring.
In fact, you know, whether it's the Red Cross, whether it's the United Nations, as the ambassador said on the panel, I think to even say that these agencies have been a complete letdown and a failure would be an understatement. But Anat, you know, you mentioned that the doctors who attended to some of the released hostages said that if you actually hear the real stories of the horrors these women were subjected to, you would not be able to sleep at night. I can tell you that when I was reading some of these accounts, you know, it sent a shiver down my spine. And I've been a journalist for close to 2 decades now. You know, we tend to think that as journalists, you know, we are perhaps relatively desensitized compared to other people. But I can tell you that it was difficult for me to even read those details, leave alone share all of them with the viewers. Do you believe...
Thanks, Neha, for bringing this important topic to your show. It's important for the world to know what happened. It's important to give a stage to those stories and horrors. And as I said, many of them cannot talk anymore, and we need to talk on their behalf and bring this information to the world, what happened to them.
You're right. These stories need to come out. The world needs to take note. Women victims cannot be forgotten. It cannot become a footnote, in this entire unfortunate, tragic chapter in our modern history. It cannot end up as a footnote. But Anat, I want to ask you this. Do you believe the international community needed to have done much more to pressurize Hamas, at the very least, to release all the women hostages?
Yes, yes. I think that, to talk in retrospect and not being in the government and within the negotiation, I can definitely talk what I think they should have done, but they should have released the women immediately and not just 10 hostages at the time. But again, I'm sure that they were doing their best, but I think that the world could do more. Qatar was instrumental, Egypt was instrumental, and of course the US. But I think that Turkey, which is in close relations with Hamas, could play a major. And Iran, I'm not expecting anything from Iran because actually Hamas are the proxies of Iran, but other nations in the world could participate here. And as you rightly said, we need the world coalition to help us manage the Gaza situation later, but also now to put pressure on Hamas and to really work together, because it's not just our problem, it's the world problem. And this is something that we will say time and again. This is not only the problem of Israel. It will knock on your door tomorrow morning. And this is something that the world leaders need to know. And I think that some are starting to realize that it's their problem as well.
All right. Irina, let me ask you this question. I truly believe that women are often the worst victims during such conflicts and wars. And like I said earlier, they're also the most easily forgotten. What more do you think the international community needs to do to ensure that the women victims are not forgotten, that it does not end up as a footnote in history, like I said? There are organizations like UN Women, for example. I'm not sure they've even spoken out enough about these crimes, leave alone demand justice.
Well, that's a great question. First of all, we should not give undue credit to the parties who actually are part of the problem. Qatar is part of the problem, not part of the solution. It's one of the main funders and supporters of Hamas. It has played a role in promoting false narratives by Hamas about the allegedly lost women hostages, buying Hamas time instead of pressuring them to release as many women as possible. And Hamas and Qatar does have leverage over these people. It hosts their leaders in Doha. It provides them with funding and backing in every way. And if it wants credit for being a mediator, then it should not have been seen as an openly partisan mouthpiece for Hamas. In terms of the international community, one of the biggest problems is that a great part of the world does not have access to full information about what is going on. The Arab world, including Palestinian civilians in Gaza, do not know the full extent of what Hamas did on October 7th. At best, they think it was a military clash that ended up in incidental civilian victims. But many countries do not publish that information at all in their countries, and the civilian populations have no idea what is going on, and therefore the sentiment is against Israel because people do not understand these violations against women, against children, the extent of the inexcusable sexual crimes. In terms of international institutions, they have long since subsisted on generous donations from the international community. And perhaps now that it has been revealed that they are not playing the role that they should not be given credit and platforms and credibility to play a role in international affairs. Perhaps it is a new time for new alliances, for new people to take on the role, and for the credibility to shift to those willing to take that action, to speak out against horrors and not engage in essentially pay to play scams. These international organizations are scamming the international community. They're taking sides. They're not helping civilians, and they're in this case they're showing clear bias in favor of Hamas and against the Israeli women who have been victimized by a terrorist organization. Their silence is complicity. Their silence enabled not only Hamas to get away with the crimes on October 7th, but to get away with continuing to abuse and hold hostages. Every moment that there is no pressure, that there is credibility given, is a moment that Hamas recruits new followers around the world. It's a moment of propaganda and information warfare victory for Hamas that allows people around the world to think it is doing something great, something to be emulated. It is like keeping silent on the crimes of ISIS. How did ISIS rise up to where it was? By presenting itself as something cool, desirable, creating a borderless state, and feeding on disaffected youth from around the world. Hamas is now capitalizing on the silence that should show it to be cowardly and shameful and weak and in every way not worthy of emulation. Instead, it's being seen as strong, as a freedom-fighting entity that is standing up to a state power. A stronger state power, and this sort of narrative is being fed by these international organizations that are failing to show that Hamas is a predator that is preying on the weak and is afraid of the strong. It's afraid of confrontations. Its leaders are in hiding in the tunnels or in Doha and Turkey and Europe. They're not fully standing up for anything. They're hiding and running away. They've committed a crime and then they ran off. They're cowards. They're not strong representatives of their society, and they're not in line with the image they're trying to project to their own people.
All right. I will give the last word to Ambassador Manjoo Seth. Ma'am, as a former diplomat, I'll ask you this. What do you think the international community needs to do? What do agencies like the United Nations need to do going forward to send out an unmistakable and unequivocal message that heinous sexual crimes against women will not be tolerated, will be taken seriously, and that women's bodies cannot be weaponized? How do we center stage this issue? Because unfortunately, this just ends up as one of the dimensions of a war or a conflict. How do we mainstream this discussion? How do we center stage this aspect?
I think, Neha, it is so important that women's sexual exploitation and abuse does not become a footnote in history or a footnote in any war. And it is important and imperative for the international community, especially who have any kind of leverage with the Hamas, including the US and Iran and Qatar, for everybody to put pressure on them, and Turkey to primarily cut off any funding, any flows. The FATF should be looking at this to prevent any money flows, illegal money flows which are going to these terror organizations. And India has faced this kind of terrorism and terror funding from across the border. So we need to also share information and put pressure. All countries need to share information and put pressure on the so-called funding countries to stop this funding to the Hamas and their leaders. They're all in different countries. They ought to be really eliminated, I think. When I say eliminated, not necessarily killed, but to be arrested and put behind bars and their funding to be cut off completely. That is the only way that Hamas and similar organizations will get the message. Otherwise, as long as funding and support keeps coming, women will continue to be, because that's part of their ideology, part of their system, that women are the weakest and we ought to target them. And it's across the world. So more organizations and all the international organizations, including media. It's such a great thing that TV9 has been able to put this center stage. And I think if more and more media organizations bring this issue center stage, all countries look at bringing this issue center stage, including by putting pressure on the people who are funding, supporting the Hamas, then alone, I think it'll make some difference. Neha.
Well, we are doing our bit, ma'am, because clearly, unitedly, we all need to send out a message that this is simply unacceptable. Women's bodies are not weapons of war. On that note, Anat Bernstein-Reich, Irina Sukerman and Ambassador Manju Seth, thank you very much to all three of you for joining me on Global Lens tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, let's now turn our attention to North Korea and its high-profile leader, Kim Jong-un. In a video that has gone viral, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un can be seen wiping his tears and looking emotional. He was speaking at a recent event where he called for efforts to tackle the country's falling birth rates and urged women to have more children. Many in the audience are also seen dabbing tears. Kim has been quoted as saying, preventing a decline in birth rates and good child care are all of our housekeeping duties, which we need to handle while working with mothers. Thanking mothers for their role in strengthening national power, Kim said, I too always think about mothers when I have a hard time dealing with the party and the state's work. The United Nations Population Fund estimates that as of 2023, the fertility rate or the average number of children being born to a woman stood at 1.8 in North Korea amid an extended fall in the rate during recent decades. However, the fertility rate still remains relatively higher than in some of North Korea's neighbors, which have been grappling with a similar downward trend. South Korea saw its fertility rate drop to a record low of 0.78 last year, while Japan saw its figure drop to 1.26. The dwindling birth rates in South Korea have caused a shortage of pediatricians, while one city is hosting matchmaking events to boost birth rates. North Korea, which has a population of about 25 million people, has in recent decades had to contend with other challenges such as serious food shortages, including deadly famines in the 1990s, often a result of natural disasters such as floods damaging harvests. And now Kim Jong-un is clearly very worried about the declining rate of birth in his country.
모두 어머니들과 힘을 합쳐 해결해야 할 우리들 모두의 집안의 일입니다.
Kim Jong-un getting emotional and wiping away his tears in that video that has now gone viral. Well, that's all the time we have on this edition of Global Lens. If you have been, thanks for watching. Do join us again tomorrow.
They picked my husband. He was tortured